Good morning, brothers and sisters. There have been a couple of funerals at our church. I'm sure at other churches too. Police officers have been shot in the recent rebellions in American streets. Pray for their families and the elect in particular. Lord Jesus, who didst thyself weep beside the grave of Lazarus, and you are touched with the movings and sorrows of our heart. Fulfill thou thy promise that you will not leave your people comfortless, but that you will come to them in comfort and strength. Reveal thyself unto thy afflicted servants, for whom our prayers are desired, and cause them to hear your words, said with efficacy and with eternal majesty. I am the resurrection and the life. Help them, O Lord, to turn to you with good discernment and to abide in you through living faith, that finding now the comfort of thy presence, they may also have a sure confidence in thee for all that is to come, until the day breaks in the new heavens and the new earth, and all of the shadows of darkness flee. Hear us for thy great mercy's sake, O Jesus Christ, our only Lord. Amen. Well, we take up our long march in New Testament introduction with Professor Everett F. Harrison. We think his thoughts after him. We've been discussing the Jewish parties, the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Zealots, and then the Essenes, a party in and around the Qumranic community, just west of the Dead Sea, but also possibly with partisans and supporters more largely in some of the Jewish communities. And we've raised some issues there in previous discussions. So we're going to finish that today and jump into the next subject, the dispersion. We might finish that today. We'll see how it goes. But in Qumran, again, down the Dead Sea area, the community, we observe certain parallels then to early Christianity, a natural circumstance in view of the Judaic provenance. But at the core, the two were radically different, for the one centered everything in the study of the law, whereas the other made the incarnate Christ and the grace the focal point of life. We don't quite like that bifurcation. The elect study God's Old Testament law, history, Psalms, Proverbs, and the elect find them as a witness to the incarnate Son of God. There was grace in the Old Testament. We get here some shades of premillennialism. The Old Testament drips with grace all the way back to Adam and Eve. Let's never forget that. You hear some of the moderns say, well, that was the reign of law. This is the dispensation of grace. No, 1,000 times no. But we press on. We'll leave that to systematics and maybe Old Testament studies. And certainly keeping our eye on practical theology. The one had a narrowly exclusive and localized fellowship, whereas the other moved out into the world mission with the gospel. Well, that's what the true Israel does. It is unfortunate that zeal to establish possible connection between Qumran and Christianity has shifted the center of study from the relation of this group to Judaism of the day. For after all, that is where the emphasis properly begins. We can see more clearly than before that Judaism could take many forms within its unifying feature of loyalty to the Torah. And now we shift to the dispersion of the Jews. Jewry was a widely diffused phenomenon at the beginning of the Christian era. Once again, interrupt. The beginning of the Christian era of the Christ was with Adam and Eve. And here, I wish I were in Prof. Everett Harrison's class so I could bring this to his attention. And here we have a New Testament scholar, shaped and conditioned by what he's been trained. But we want to be of a different type, to bring all of the disciplines together. We learn of the covenant of grace that's transpires across the entirety of history, the redemptive covenant of God omnipotently calling his elect, both in the Old and New Testaments. We carry on. A large settlement continued to exist in Babylonia. Not surprised by that. The descendants of those who for one reason or another did not return to Palestine after the captivity, the 70 years in Babylon. In the latter days of Jeremiah, a company of Jews fled to Egypt, the precursors of many more in the Hellenistic period. You can see that in the Maccabees. Who wants to be around conflict and guerrilla war? Pushes people out to regions of safety for the sake of their families and children. Common sense. The Alexandrian area was marked by shifting of populations on a large scale, and the Jews were not slow to participate in it, for the outside world offered greater commercial opportunities. It's like, if I can break in here, just like the city of Detroit, where I grew up, attracted people from all around the area, and many from the South came into Detroit for opportunities to work at Ford and Chevrolet, Chrysler. All of the auto plants were up in there. Many people were drawn to that city. Same idea here. Some were forced out by internal strife during the period of the later Hasmoneans. Others were removed as captives of war and were ultimately set free, with the result that most of them remained where they were and formed Jewish communities. But even more went abroad of their own volition. Heavy concentrations of Jews formed at Alexandria in Egypt, in Cyrenaica, in the major cities of Asia Minor, like Cilicia, where Paul was from, and at Rome. We've had that floating question of how many synagogues were in that massive city. It only took 10 men to form a synagogue. How many were in Naples? Or some of the major cities in Sicily or Athens? I don't read of St. Paul when he gets to Athens, Acts 17, engaging with the synagogue, but we do find him in Corinth, related to the synagogue of Corinth. Jews were more numerous outside Palestine than within the country, their numbers running into several millions. This will be the subplot, foundation upon which Paul would begin his work. He started in the synagogues and moved outwards. Indeed, it could be said that there was not a people in the world that did not contain a portion of this nation. Yet the ties with the homeland were maintained with considerable success. Jerusalem was the capital not only of Palestine, but of world Jewry. Religiously, it was to the Jews that Rome was to the world politically. To it, the faithful resorted as pilgrims at festival time. Many returned to the land to spend their last days on its sacred soil and to be buried there. To the attraction of the temple, the Herodian temple that we spent some time talking about, must be added the unifying power of the Torah, God's kingdom with the Jews, believers in Messiah, the elect, hoping for the royal David to come. were taught by the Torah, and they had that historical consciousness, and they were conscious of their boundaries with the pagan polytheists in Greece and Rome. So they maintained that as a witness. And we, here in the post-resurrectional period of the covenant of grace, the inter-adventual period, we sometimes call it, can look back to our brothers and sisters who maintained the faith, forward-looking to Messiah to come to crush the head of the serpent, of the seed of Eve, and the seed of Abraham, the seed of David, the royal governor who would rise up, whose ways have been from everlasting. Micah 5:2 will be born in Bethlehem, and many other messianic promises. We ever want to keep we're in New Testament now, to ever keep our eyes on Old Testament theology, doctrine. Even Daniel, we talked about Daniel 7 a while, how he forecast and saw the Ancient of Days and the invincibility of the kingdom of the Messiah. Let's get rid of some of the modern shallow notions we've been shaped by. It looks at the Old Testament as dated and barbaric and savage, compliments of the German hot music of Bultmann and Grafenwälder. Just love that quote by James Packer, the hot Lutheran music of Bultmann. That's a winner. That's a keeper, as it were. So our people, we may have Gentile extraction, perhaps Celtic in my own tradition, my own ancestry, perhaps. Looks that way. Certainly English, Scots, some Irish. While it's true that the law and other portions of the scriptures have been rendered into Greek, done at Alexandria, Egypt, under one of the Ptolemies, and could therefore be studied outside the land, reading the Old Testament in Greek, by those Jews who had made Greek their adopted language. Well, adopted language, you had children who grew up speaking Greek and then had to go back and learn Hebrew in the synagogue. Synagogue to this day still teaches Hebrew to the kids. They can read Hebrew. Get ready for bar mitzvah. It is customary to speak of Hellenistic Judaism as the development that occurred outside the land, with Josephus and Philo as leading representatives, the former having chief interest in expounding the history of the people for the benefit of the Romans. Josephus is a bit of an apologist for his people. I've got somewhere down in over here, I think. I have Josephus in an ancient volume. The cover's fallen off. Probably need to get a new one. It'd be worth studying him as an ancillary commentator on Old Testament history. And he wrote the history of the Jews as an apologetic for his people. And the latter, Philo, an Alexandrian Jew, being intent on philosophy, seeking to commend his faith to cultivated pagans. Josephus was a man of letters who resided in Rome, and Philo made his home in Alexandria. This division into Palestinian and Hellenistic Judaism, however, seems somewhat arbitrary, because the homeland of the Jews had for a long time been exposed to Hellenizing influences. Any product of Judaism that shows marked effects of Hellenistic environment deserves to be called Hellenistic, irrespective of geography. Under the Ptolemies, that was one of the four factions that broke off from Alexander the Great's conquest and who was given Egypt. And we've discussed the Maccabean period before with the Seleucids, a second of the four segments after Alexander the Great. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria had become the leading cultural center, commercial center, financial center, academic center, philosophic center, and you still bore a ship in its little tiny harbor. We did that out and anchored out from Alexandria a number of times. It was a delight and a joy to get in there and walk around the old area. Here, about the time of our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, Philo wrote a number of treatises that reflect his debt to Greek thought. Now, this becomes of interest to us also as we work over in the broader area of church history and the influence of Platonism on the catechetical school in Alexandria in the later Christian period. We stand from the standpoint of Moses in the Christian era. We tend to view Philo in the time of Christ as the beginning of the Christian era. We've addressed that. Rejecting Greek religion as polytheistic and degrading, Philo nevertheless adopted Greek philosophy to a generous degree and proposed to make use of it in commending his own ancestral faith to the pagan world. Superficially, the effort to awaken interest in the Jewish law might seem futile, but Philo managed it by the way in which he handled the Old Testament scriptures, making use of the allegorical approach. Which is a way to impose a philosophy onto the text rather than, as we insist upon, reading the text in its historical context and accepting what the author intended. This was a way of making the harder portions perhaps more palatable, but we don't import backwards. And I'm delighted to have heard a lecture yesterday by Dr. Lee Gatiss on the 19th article of 39 articles of the Church of England. He was insisting on a historical and linguistic, grammatical, historical approach to the 39 articles, rather than reading back into, eisegetically talking about the articles. Well, that's what Philo was doing with the Old Testament. Superficially, the effort to awaken interest in the Jewish law, that was his intent. The plain meaning was in most cases set aside to make room for the claim that Moses was talking about the very thing that engrossed the Greek philosophers, only doing it with greater insight because he had the benefit of special revelation. The highest wisdom was to be found in the law of God. For example, the trees that God caused to grow in the Garden of Eden indicate the virtues that God plants in the soul. It might be added that this will come to really influence medieval, if we can use that category in church history, medieval exegesis in some quarters. Now, with Venerable Bede of the 7th century in northern England, it is often said that he was an allegorist. A review of his writings does not reveal that. What he does is, if he draws an analogy, it's always rooted in grammatical historical exegesis. And what he's doing here is application. And he's trying to energize the northern leaders to greater faith. Philo made generous use of the Platonic theories of ideas. Let's break. I always had a lot of trouble as a philosophy major, ultimately, after a heavy science background. I had a tough time getting my arms around this Platonic idea of ideas, these eternal forms, this eternal thing up there, which is reflected down here where we're at with the particulars of life. You got a cow, you got a perfect ideal up in the eternal world of ideas of a perfect cow. You got a house, participates in the eternal ideal of the house. And you can see in Plato, Socrates, they're reaching after God. We're religious beings, homo religiosus, we say. It doesn't surprise us, but they were not a people of the Old Testament law. They were outside God's people. Yet the ideas were held by Philo in strict subordination to God, who alone is the absolute sense. To Philo, the ideas were not static patterns, but dynamic causative factors, which he identified with the powers, the Hebrew word hosts, that surround and minister to the Almighty. Another term that served him well was the logos. This he tended to make equivalent to the ideas and the powers, but with various nuances of meaning. As with the later Judaism in general, in distinction from the Judaism of the biblical period, Philo felt the necessity of keeping God aloof from any direct contact with the world. Well, that's kind of Platonic. And we'll see that emerges very clearly with the Gnostics of the 2nd and 3rd century of our adventual period. This influences Gnostic theology in the Egyptian area that Irenaeus of Lyons will argue vigorously against and successfully. There are several complicated versions of Gnosticism, but this dualism, matter is bad, spirit is good. And that kind of comes over into the issue of mandatory clerical celibacy that infects the church for a long time and receives official mandate of officialdom in Rome by the 11th century. Might be Celtic ministers were married probably up until the 10th century. Although there's parts like the church where there's voluntary celibacy, like Benedictus and his monks. That's a whole other subject, the history of celibacy. And St. Augustine, whom we love, and whose volumes, all of them we read, 50 or 100 of them, whatever they were, a few years back, is badly mistaken on the ideas of marriage and the clergy. I even think Jerome partook of that spirit. And you're lewd and lascivious if you get married. It's not what St. Paul says. And that was certainly imputed to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer for his 2 marriages. You lewd, in 1555, you're lewd and lascivious. It's a Roman idea. I think they've softened their approach given the advent of mass communications. I try to hide some of that stuff we capture in historical work. There was a day when they were behind closed doors doing stuff with vigor. But it's still there, and they've updated their apologetics for it, but have not succeeded in disbanding their fakeries. The influence of this philosopher, Philo, on Judaism was checked by the spread and monopolizing force of Pharisaism. His influence on Christianity was felt in 2 areas. As the gospel came into contact with the pagan world, it was obliged, to some extent, to talk about the language of religious philosophy. Traces of this are found in Paul and the 4th gospel. Break. We're not convinced of this, but we'll see how he argues it. Both writers were probably acquainted with Philo's works. Philo's influence was even stronger on the Alexandrian fathers of the church, who thought of themselves as Christian Gnostics, applying to the scriptures the allegorical method of exegesis. Well, here he ends this section on the background. We're still in the background. He's going to move forward to talk. He's got a lot of stuff coming up. He's got a little bibliography here. F. Bruce, Second Thoughts on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Miller Burroughs, The Dead Sea Scrolls, 1955. More Light on the Dead Sea Scrolls, same author, 1958. F.M. Cross, he's a famous commentator. Ancient Library of Qumran. Derwachter, Preparing the Way for Paul. Alfred Edersheim, The Temple. I think I got that. He's written another big volume here, something History of the Messiah. I'm drawing a blank, but great name. A Jewish man who converted to Christ through Presbyterian ministry, and then later years became Church of England, and I think he died in Oxford. Alfred Edersheim, walking the streets of Oxford as a converted Jew. Gaster, Dead Sea Scriptures. Charles Gunerbert, The Jewish World in the Time of Jesus. Jean Juster, Les Juifs dans l'Empire Romain. Australian Box, The Religion and Worship of the Synagogue, 1907. That sounds kind of interesting. G.F. Moore, Judaism, 2 volumes, Harvard Press, 1946. That also looks interesting. H. Rowley, The Dead Seas in the New Testament, SPCK, 1960. Shura on the Diaspora, which we just finished talking about. Christopher Stendhal, big name in New Testament studies, Scrolls in the New Testament. And H.A. Wolfson, 2 volumes on Philo, Harvard University Press. Well, this might be an advantageous time to start bringing this to a close. He's going to go on to discuss literature and a description of the Apocryphal books here in the inter-testamental period, Assumption of Moses, some philosophic works, apologetic and miscellaneous pieces, and the influence of these on the New Testament. As then we will, on page 46, round out our study on the backgrounds of the New Testament, but we'll also thereafter want to be talking about the Koine Greek. But let's bring this session to a close with prayer. Keep us, we beseech thee, O Lord, from any abuse of your great, great name, Jehovah, of the Trinity, in any ignorant, vain, thoughtless, irreverent, profane, or wicked way. Keep us from false teachings about your titles, attributes, ordinance, and works. Keep us, O Lord, from German liberalism or those denying your omnipotent decrees and your utterly comprehensive providence, like Arminians and others. Keep us from belittling, as is done so often in the mainline denomination, the infallibility, inspiration, and authority of your word. We've seen it in our studies of Daniel again, or any other way of murmuring or misinterpreting or quibbling over your perspicuous, clear word, or any other ways in which we may have offended thy majesty. Keep us from these things, we beseech thee, by the omnipotent hand of the triune God, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Well, brothers and sisters, we move onwards to church history after. And as we do church history, we're always keeping the Old and New Testament in mind and systematics in mind for church history. We'll be working with Prof. Earl Cairns again today. And then we always want to keep our eyes on practical theology. I talked to the man across the street. We've been talking about Philo and the Diaspora, and we can point to the man across the street, how God was in his providence sending the Jews, elect and reprobate, out into the nations, forming communities, and it would be a wide platform for later promulgation, practical theology, for missions and evangelism and teaching, out of which the omnipotent hand of God would be governing his kingdom after the post-resurrectional period. That's why we date history BC, before Christ, and history after Christ. But before Christ is kind of a misnomer too, because Christ is in the Old Testament and before the foundation of the world, co-equal with the Father and the Spirit, co-equal in majesty and glory and all of the shared attributes. But that's a study for a later day. So we've concluded with prayer, and we sign off for this segment. Godspeed and God bless.